Binding application configuration to IEnumerable to IDictionary and implement advanced validations, or in C# options pattern. Hello and welcome to Code with Sar. I'm Sar. How are you doing? This is the 5th video in the series Building a Library with Me. We've covered C# extension method, C# delegate, and in the last video we talked about options pattern, and in this one we're going to talk more about the options pattern. There's going to be 4 topics: binding to an IEnumerable, binding to an IDictionary, binding validations, and then as a practical example, we'll see how these parts being used in the JWT Authentication library. Let's dive in. Binding values from configuration to an IEnumerable is relatively straightforward. Firstly, we create an array in the configuration file. Well, actually, for the demo purpose, let me create another section called animal info. Then we put an array there, for example, known animals. And we put 3 animals here, a dog, a cat, and a cow. Since this is a new section, we'll create a new class. We'll map the animal info section to this class, and we'll map the known animals array to this IEnumerable of string. The name of the property needs to be exactly the same as the name of the array, so that when bind is called, it knows to assign the value properly. Let's see how to consume it. Start by copying the code from the last time, and then we can see what needs to be changed. First is a type to bound to towards application options, and it is animal info options now. Second is a section. It is a child section named animal info of application options. So here we need to call get section again of application options. And of course, the return type need to be animal info options as well. For the demo, we're going to output the animal one by another. And let's see when it runs. On the output, there's dog, there's cat, and the cow. That's how the binding works when IEnumerable. Let me repeat myself with the key information here. For the binding to work, we need 2 pieces of information: the class to talk the bound and the section. In addition to that, we know that the property of the class could be an IEnumerable. Configurations could also be bound to a dictionary. For example, we could create an animal speech object in configurations with key value pairs. From the configuration perspective, you cannot tell if it is supposed to be bound with a property or a dictionary. They all maps to a JSON object. But from the class perspective, a dictionary does not need to know the keys ahead of time. For example, for animal speech, I don't need a class named animal speech options, and then have a property named dog, then a property named cat, and a third property named cow. What I'll have instead is an animal speech property on animal info, which is a dictionary. In this example, the animal speech is formed up with the key value pairs. The keys are the name of the animal, the value will be the sound of the animal. Once the bind is finished, it is just a matter of consuming a regular dictionary. For example, here I'm going to output the animal name, the speech of the animal. Again, under the options pattern, we bound values to array while binding values to dictionary. Having the capability to bind the configurations to a class is already great. What makes the options pattern better is that it integrates with validation. Next, I'll show you 2 ways to do validation on options. 1. Call validate and provide a delegate. The delegate takes in the option instance and then will expect to return a boolean. When it is true, the validation passes. Otherwise, the validation failed. For example, here what we are saying is, if the length of the name is smaller or equal to 2, it is good. Otherwise, it will fail. Let's see how it will look like when it runs. One minor thing to mention here is that the validation doesn't happen on registration, it happens on injection. So that if I invoke anything that requires the application options here, the validation will happen. And we see a validation error that occurred. It is good, flexible, and easy to use. The only defect of this method is there's no way to provide an error message. The next method allows it, and that is to use data annotation. For example, the string length attribute, it allows us to specify a maximum length of a string. Not only that, but also a custom error message. To reach the same goal, I'm going to set the maximum length here to be 2 and the error message to be the application name length must less than or equal to 2. There are, of course, other data annotation attributes that we can use. For example, range for numbers, regular expressions, that supports all kinds of validation scenarios. I'll put a link in the description, FYI. Come back, there's an additional step. We'll need to call validate data annotations when we add the options. Now let's see what happens when the validation fails. As you can see, it is a similar exception, but the message is more friendly. There are, of course, other ways to do validations. For example, I validate the options of T interface. It's more complex and more powerful. However, these two are the most common ways, and they are by themselves very powerful already. So I'm just going to stop here. Let's take a look at how is options pattern used in the JWT Authentication library. The design intention for the library is, firstly, it will allow the user to specify the options in configuration files. And then they can override it again in the service registration during the startup class. When I pick what options to be there, those are the ones either the library could not know ahead of time, or we want to enable the caller of the library to override the defaults. For example, we will always provide a default value for issuer sign-in secret, but at the same time, in most cases, we would want the user to provide the value by themselves. Let's see how it's that done. In the library, we created this method add JWT Auth. It is an extension method for iService collection. So the first parameter is going to be iService collection. And for the second parameter, we are taking in a delegate that will take action on JWT Auth options. I'll explain why later. And the third parameter is a section name for the configuration. Line 28 calls add options on the service collection. And by this moment, we know it's the options pattern, and it will create the options builder. We didn't touch configure method during the session. This is just a way for us to get dependent service from the dependency container. For example, iConfiguration as well as the logger. On line 30, we start to get the options of the application settings. The section name, when provided, going to be the user-specified one, but it does have a default value from the JWT Auth options class. In most cases, the user do not need to worry about the section name, but if there happen to be a conflict, this parameter allows the user to specify a different section name in the configuration. Okay, once the section is decided, we'll bind it to the JWT Auth options object. And we all understand this is going to put the values from configuration to the object. Then in line 31, it will check if the config delegate exists. If it does, it will invoke it and pass along the options object. The rest of the code checks the options a little bit, but it is irrelevant to the options pattern. Let's take a look at the consumer's code. On the consumer side, code starts with calling this add JWT Auth extension method. Remember, we have 3 parameters for this extension method. The first one would be the services by itself, and then we have 2 parameters to deal with. The first one, that takes line 26 to 41, is a delegate. This delegate executes after the binding to the configuration had already been done in the options object. So if there is values set in the configuration, it is already there on the object. But then we can overwrite the value here if we want. For example, we could overwrite the issuer's sign-in secret. It is also a chance for us to add in more options that cannot be bound directly, like the one named onValidate user information, which takes in another delegate. Of course, if we don't want to use the default section name, we can specify the second parameter here. Then, instead of the default section name, it will use the section name here, named another section name for the binding. And that's how we put in the options pattern into use. The library uses the options pattern to bind it to a configuration section, and then it takes a delegate to allow further customization. And as a library author, We also need to consider those edge cases like naming conflicts in settings and so on. Thanks for watching. I hope you find the options pattern useful, and press the like button to let me know if you enjoyed this video. That is the best encouragement to make me keep up. We've been going over the consumer side of the configurations, and I'm thinking about making another video to talk about the input side, aka providers. Things like provider settings in environment variable, in command line, in app settings for different environments like development or production, so on and so forth. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear topics like that. Keep coding, keep improving, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, take care.